Hello, Year 10. This is a very short video just to talk you through question 3D, which is easily the most difficult question on paper 3, and possibly out of all 3 of your exam papers. And I'm going to just briefly talk through and highlight some of the key aspects that you need to make sure that you're including in this answer so as to get to the higher mark bands. So if we look at the question, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about why America failed in Vietnam? Explain your answer using both interpretations and your own knowledge. And you can see here that the question or the structure in the question tells you what you need to make sure that you are doing. So always, because it starts with asking you about how far do you agree with interpretation 2, start your answer off by addressing and analysing interpretation 2. Also, it's going to be asking you about why America failed in Vietnam. So I'm not interested in, why the Americans won. Okay, that would be the wrong question. So we're looking at why America failed in Vietnam. And here it tells you that you need to explain your answer. You need to make sure you're using both interpretations and your own knowledge of the historical context as well. So really it's 16 marks, but there's also the 4 marks included in that for spelling, grammar, and technical language as well. So let's have a look at our first interpretation. So if we remember from our assessment, the first interpretation, there wasn't a whole lot written about America themselves, but what the interpretation was talking about was that the North Vietnamese had a lot of resources to their disposal because of their alliance with other communist countries, namely the USSR and China. And this is why they were militarily very strong. That is not to say that the US were weaker militarily than the North Vietnamese. It's just that the Americans underestimated how much in the way of resources the North Vietnamese had. Okay, so very briefly, that's what the interpretation was saying. The interpretation then went on to talk about how the North Vietnamese had an advantage because they had an intimate knowledge of the landscape and they used that to their advantage. So we can say from the interpretation that America failed in Vietnam because they underestimated the military strength of the North Vietnamese and they underestimated the tactics that were used by the North Vietnamese because of their knowledge of the rainforest and the surrounding areas. Okay, so if we look here, we look at our first paragraph. So again, as I highlighted there, you need to start by agreeing or disagreeing with interpretation 2. Our structures always indicate that you say, I partly agree with interpretation 2 as to why the US failed in the Vietnam War. This is because it states that North Vietnam could rely, and you need to quote here, and I've quoted, could rely on billions of dollars worth of aid from the communist bloc, the USA, China, and their allies. And then you need to support that quotation with your own knowledge. And remember, to get into the top marked bands, you need to be precise with your own knowledge. And that means including things like dates, names, places, to help you to be more precise. So, for example, from my own knowledge, I know this is true because the North Vietnamese were supplied from their communist allies with a total assistance of over 2 billion between 1965 and 1968. So we can see here precise own knowledge, including things like 2 billion and dates here as well. Weapons such as AK-47, infantry weapon or surface-to-air missiles, so again I've quoted directly from the interpretation, were also supplied to the Viet Cong and brought in a little bit of own knowledge here via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This meant the North Vietnamese were militarily very strong, which was underestimated by the US. See, what I've done here, I've linked back to the question. So I'm highlighting to the examiner here, so a little bit of an analysis here. I've highlighted to the examiner that this, the military strength was a reason of the North Vietnamese, was a reason why the US failed in Vietnam. Okay, so just one sentence has been added in. In addition, because we remember, if we want to get into the top mark bands, we need to be making sure that we include at least 3 quotes and analysis for each interpretation. So in addition, interpretation 2 states that the North Vietnamese had intimate knowledge. So again, a little bit of a quote there of their own country. And from my own knowledge, I know that Americans struggled to fight the North Vietnamese because they used guerrilla warfare. So again, highlighting here. The type of warfare required a strong knowledge of the jungles, something the Americans did not have, and relied on the ability to wear down the enemy soldiers' morale. Indeed, here's some precise zone knowledge here. 11% of deaths were caused by booby traps. So there we have it. A top-level answer to using interpretation 2. I'm not going to talk too much about interpretation, about the next interpretation, because I think you get the gist with this interpretation of how it should be structured. But very briefly, you need to make sure that you include a judgment, that you support that judgment by quotes from the interpretation. You need to support that with your own knowledge and make sure that it is precise with dates, figures, and places. And that you should be making sure that you include up to 3 quotes with own knowledge for each interpretation. Okay, after you've analysed the interpretation highlighted in the question, then you should move on to the following interpretation. And I pop this here just for those of you that are adjusting your answers and you want to pause the video, maybe take a read of this and maybe use some of the information in this interpretation to add into your own answer. A final area to address is the conclusion or the overall judgment at the end. And this is really important to include. This should not be, again, to get marks, you need to make sure that you're including a judgment. Lots of you didn't include a judgment, and this meant that you lost fairly straightforward marks. So even if you write a couple of sentences, you are likely to get some marks. If you don't write anything, it can really hinder your chances of getting the top marks. The other thing that you need to be aware of is that the judgment isn't a place for you to bring in new information, and it really shouldn't be a summary or a rewriting of everything that you already said. Instead, it should be your opportunity to say which interpretation you agree with and why. So if we look here, overall, I think the most convincing interpretation is interpretation 1. This is because even though the US did not have good leadership during the Vietnam War from the president or support from the American public, the US greatly underestimated the strength of resources and military understanding that the North Vietnamese had during the Vietnam War. And then I might add another sentence there to say, and this is the reason why this is the main reason why the US lost the war in Vietnam. Okay, so again, you might want to pause this slide and add into your own answer.